My name's Neil Collins. I'm a sound designer from the UK, and here is my Showreel tutorial on how I implemented all the sounds in the suburb level of Cube 2. Before I began designing the sounds for the game, I put together an assets list so I could keep track of all the sounds I needed, what I needed to make these sounds, and notes and dates relating to each sound. I used colour coding to make things clearer. First thing I looked at was what I wanted to get out of the level, and how I wanted the level to feel, as this would inevitably affect the choices I made in terms of character sound design and the various level sounds in general. I decided fairly on that although Cube 2 is essentially a shoot 'em up with monsters, I wanted a certain realism to the game too. I wanted the weapons to feel real, so of course they would need to sound real. When looking at the weapon sounds, I decided on two distinct differences between the player's weapons and the monsters. The player's weapons would use real weapon samples mixed with various samples I recorded. The monsters' weapons would be mostly laser based, to differentiate between the two. Using Pro Tools and Logic, I layered various sounds from libraries and my own recordings to create the gun sounds I wanted. Using processing such as EQ, compression, pitching and limiting, I was able to create these sounds. When imported into FMOD, these sounds were manipulated further using pitch and volume automation, so as to give these weapons a random element. A good example of this is the reload on the shotgun. Every time the shells hit the ground, they do so with slightly varying pitch and volume, so as not to become repetitive and to add realism to the game. By using layers, I was able to separate the different parts of the player's weapons and treat them differently, so enabling me to vary not only the mechanisms, but also the pitch of the shot and the body of the weapon. The monsters' weapons were slightly different in my approach. As they would be laser-based, there wasn't much need for weapon mechanisms. They would all be activated by a button, so it was more a case of matching the laser noises to the monsters. I looked at their size and characteristics and used sample libraries and synth sounds to make laser sounds that suited the characteristics of the monsters. Again in FMOD I randomised pitch and volume so as not to become too repetitive. The one exception to this was the weapon sound of the knight. Although he does use a laser weapon, he also uses a boil and chain. So I found a great sample using my library and was especially pleased with the result. The monsters vary greatly in their characteristics, from huge devil-like characters through to small animal-like ones. Many of the sounds I used for the monsters I voiced myself, and then pitched to make them sound unhuman.
You got me. You got me. You got me. You got me.
I then layered them with other effects, and using EQ blended them together to create one sound. In FMOD, I again added more randomness to sounds using pitch and volume randomisation. For many of the smaller characters, or more animal-like characters, I used real animal sounds from my library, and this worked really well. I didn't manipulate them too much. The sound of a pig squealing or a spider monkey is alarming enough in gameplay. By using multi-sounds in FMOD, I was able to use a number of samples which would get triggered randomly, thus adding a lot of variation to these sounds. The monster's footsteps were again made to fit the character of the monster. Heavier, lower pitched footsteps for the bigger monsters, light, high pitched steps for the smaller characters. Using Pro Tools and Logic, I created sounds for the various items in the game. The power-ups, ammo, respawn were made using a mixture of samples and also by using and manipulating synth sounds. I wanted to use the music function of the FMOD session, but not necessarily for music. There was a parameter for the health of the character, so what I decided on was a heartbeat increasing in speed and volume as the player's health decreased. I did this by using a heartbeat sample, copying it and pitching it up as the heartbeat parameter changed. At the same time, I increased the volume curve. I also added a drone synth that increased in volume towards the player's demise. This was accompanied by a voiceover warning, telling the player that they needed to find medical supplies quick.
Medical attention required. Medical attention required. Medical attention required.
I also used the number of monsters left parameter to add various voiceover sound bites coming from the player's perspective. I randomised these so as not to become repetitive, and I also related them to the number of monsters left.
Come on.
There is a radio voiceover that kicks off the game, made using the sound of static, and a voiceover that warns the player throughout the game. This is to emulate radio contact with camp to immerse the player even further. Using a high-pass filter, I was able to get the vocal to sound as if it was coming from a radio. I then added various sound sources to the game, such as the sound of this waterfall. Using edit mode, I was able to place the sound in the game, and then using FMOD, I played with the distance parameter till the waterfall sounded like it was coming from the right space, and decreasing in volume to the right degree when the player walked away from the source. Finally, I connected FMOD to the game in real time. Here I could adjust parameters in live play, making sure all the volumes were as I wanted them in the game. Thank you for taking the time to watch my showreel.